Okay, welcome to Erev Rosh Hashanah Sunday shiur. Okay, the Erev Rosh Hashanah Sunday shiur title is Rabbi Akiva's guidelines for receiving a good judgment on Yom Hadin, but a little bit of that was marketing on my part because Erev Rosh Hashanah, I didn't know if people wouldn't be here, unless it was like relevant for Rosh Hashanah. The original title was Rabbi Akiva's view of human existence. Okay, and that's a more conservative title because I'm not 100% sure how much this has to do with Rosh Hashanah and how much it doesn't, but we're gonna aim to view it through that lens. Okay, so overview. This is a condensed version of a 3-part shiur I gave in February over the course of 3 parts. And I got to thank specifically Esti Lichter, Brooke Schwartz, and Nava Yastrab for their involvement in helping develop these ideas over the course of this. The objective is very simple structurally, which is there's a mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which we're going to try to understand according to the Rambam and use it to prepare for Rosh Hashanah and for the upcoming year. Okay. The note to self, I know some of the guys, there's a little bit of, I foreshadowed the fact that we would talk a little bit about free will, but I don't want to get bogged down in that mire. Okay. You can ask questions, but I reserve the right to free will something else. And then one just disclaimer, which is, I think I gave the same disclaimer when I gave my shiur 2 years ago on Erev Yom HaKippurim about the Yud Gimel Midos HaRachamim, which was when I first went into the topic of the Yud Gimel Midos HaRachamim, I was a little nervous because it's metaphysics. And I, at the time, my Chumash Rebbe, Rabbi Yoni Sachs, was like, I was consulting him, and he said, it's right to be nervous when you go into metaphysics, but he said that it is a reality that ultimately there are a lot of areas that we will never know if we really know clearly. And he said, as long as you are taking a step from a less mature view to a more mature view of the area, then that's a good thing, So we're going to brush up against metaphysics here. The goal is going to be to avoid metaphysics as much as we can, but I felt like I need to give a disclaimer that I can't promise you that the metaphysics I'm saying today is going to be accurate, but I can definitely promise you that it's going to be taking me from a less mature view to a more mature view. You can ask metaphysics questions, but doesn't mean that we're going to have answers. Okay, the particular outline of the shiur is going to be 7 steps. Okay, we're going to start by reading and translating the mishnah. Then we're going to raise the major questions and difficulties. Then we're going to read and translate the Rambam's commentary and other writings just to get what he says. We're going to note which questions and answers he resolves, but then he's going to add a few. Okay, then we're going to, in order to address the questions, we're going to have to go into the Talmudic sources of one of the Rambam's comments. Based on that, we're going to get the main idea and use that to answer our remaining questions. And then the final step will be to consider the practical implications of the main idea as far as Rosh Hashanah is concerned. Okay. All right. That's the plan. Here we go. Read and translate the mishnah. So this is mishnah in Pirkei Avos, chapter 3, mishnah 18 in the Rambam's version. Something is funny with the numbering in Pirkei Avos. You have to look in your particular editions. Also, with this particular mishnah, there are a lot of textual discrepancies about how the mishnah concludes. So there are others who don't read the mishnah this way. Okay, so this is the Rambam. Hakol tzafui v'harashus nisuna uvatov ha'olam nidon v'hakol lefi rov ha'ma'aseh aval lo al pi ha'ma'aseh. Really difficult to translate, okay? Anyone want to take a crack at just hakol tzafui? So there is actually a different version of the mishnah that says hakol tzafun. Everything is hidden. That's not the Rambam's version. So the Sefer HaSharashim of the Radak, he quotes a bunch of psukim. Basically, tzafui means seen, watched, looked over, supervised. So I'm going to translate it with the most general translation, which is seen. Okay, everything is seen, and we're going to see it means by God. Okay, v'harashus nisuna. How do you translate rashus nisuna? Permission is given. Okay, so that's probably the most literal translation. Permission is given. There's only one instance of the word reshus in all of Tanakh, and it's in Ezra, which is very late. This is, again, Sefer HaSharashim of the Radak. He says it means command and authorization. Chazal use it to mean permission or authorization. There's a theory by Ibn Janach who says that it is related to the word rosh, like authority or head, but Radak seems to disagree with that. So I'm going to translate it for our purposes. Oh, sorry. So I chose the word control because apparently that comes from the related to the word authority. But I don't like saying authority is given to man because God really has the authority, right? But man has control. Okay, so whatever, you could say freedom, you could say permission, but choice is given. All right, so everything is seen by God, but control is given. Uvatov ha'olam nidon, and with goodness the world is judged. V'hakol, here's the most complicated part. V'hakol lefi rov ha'ma'aseh, everything is in accordance with the multitude of action, aval lo al pi ha'ma'aseh, but not based on the action. Okay, so once again, in flowy form, so that's the reading and translating. We're going to move on to the questions now. So again, everything is seen by God, but control is granted to man, and the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the multitude of action, but not based on the action. Now, ordinarily, this is the part where I would ask you for the questions, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get done by 12. So I'm going to go ahead and list the questions. Okay, so the thing that attracted me to this mishnah was, what the heck is it doing in Pirkei Avos? Okay, Pirkei Avos is about ethics. And this seems to be about metaphysics, about how God runs the world. Okay, how do we know that Pirkei Avos is about ethics? Well, if you read Pirkei Avos, you'll see it's about ethics. Okay, but we're basing ourselves on the Rambam here, and the Rambam in his introduction to Shmona Prakim, which Shmona Prakim is his introduction to Avos, so this is his introduction to the introduction, says the sages, peace be upon them, have said, Haiman debayla mehave chasida l'kayim mili de Avos. This is in Bava Kama Lamed Amud Aleph. Whoever wishes to be a chassid, not with a capital CH, but with a lowercase ch, okay, should fulfill the words of Avos. Chassid, I think our Tehillim shiur, we decided that the best translation of chassid is an extra righteous person, okay? Pious has a little bit too much of a religious connotation, okay? So if you want to be extra righteous, you should fulfill the words of Avos. And the Rambam goes on and says, we have no level higher than Chassidus except for prophecy, and Chassidus is what brings one to prophecy. As they said, Chassidus brings a person to Ruach HaKodesh. It is clear from their words that living by the ethical teachings of this tractate brings a person to prophecy, since this tractate encompasses a great portion of good character traits. Okay, so I don't want. This doesn't mean that everything in Pirkei Avos is ethics. For example, you have, especially in chapter 5, there were 10 miracles done at Yam Suf. Hard to say that that's ethical, but definitely the main theme is ethics. And I think it's reasonable to assume that in chapter 3. Which is still an ethical portion, that we're going to learn some ethical idea from here. So the question is why are we talking about God's knowledge and free will in something that has to do with ethics? Because that's question number 1. Okay. Any questions on question number 1? Okay. 2. Okay. Classic question. If everything is foreseen, how can man have free will? Okay, that's the classical question, which we will touch upon. Okay, and I think that when people are talking about this question in Jewish context, this is the closest mishnah that this is the closest text of Chazal you can point to that explicitly identifies that as juxtaposes those two ideas. Okay. 3, what is meant by judged in this context, right? Everything, uvatov ha'olam nidon, the world is judged with goodness. Are we talking about judgment upon death? Are we talking about judgment on Rosh Hashanah? Are we talking about judged continually throughout throughout your life? 4, what is meant by the world is judged with goodness, as opposed to what? Badness, right? The Havamina is saying, don't think that the world is judged based on blank, really it's judged with goodness. That's what I would have thought about God, though. Of course, he judges the world with goodness. 5, which types of ma'aseh, when it says everything is al lefi rov ha'ma'aseh, avalo al pi ha'ma'aseh, everything is according to the multitude of actions, but not according to the action. What action is he talking about? Is he talking about all actions? Is it specifically mitzvos and averos? Is it something else? Question 6, what does the phrase lefi rov ha'ma'aseh mean? According to the multitude of action. And likewise, what does it mean by but not in accordance with the action? What is the action that the world is not judged based on? Okay, so I think these are the major questions. Okay, any questions on the questions? Okay, onward. Phase 3. We're going to read and translate the Rambam's commentary, and we're going to get into some ideas, but not the main idea. The ideas we're getting into now are just in order to understand what the Rambam is saying, but then we're going to use the Rambam. We're going to try to develop an idea from the Rambam after that in stage 5 and 6. Okay. So the Rambam begins with the intro. He says, this collection of statements encompasses many great ideas only befitting of someone like Rabbi Akiva. Oh, by the way, this is I said that in the title, this is Rabbi Akiva. It was part of a series of statements he's making. So that's just an interesting methodology point here. I feel like you could say that about any of Chazal, but apparently Rabbi Akiva is the golden standard of ideas. And so you can expect more out of this one than other Mishnayos and Pirkei Avos. He says, and this is its explanation in a concise form, provided that you already understand what came before in the prefatory chapters, which is the Shmona Prakim. So the Rambam is presupposing we've all learned Shmona Prakim in depth and have mastered it, and that way he can only make references. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is we're going to consult Shmona Prakim when necessary, but he's assuming familiarity. Okay, so back to the Mishnah, and what I'm doing is I'm going to highlight each clause of the Mishnah before we do the Rambam's commentary. So this is his commentary on Hakol Tzafui, everything is seen by God. Okay, so it's going to sound like he doesn't say anything, but he says, Rabbi Akiva said that everything in the world is known before him, exalted is he, and he sees it. This is what is meant by everything is seen. Okay, now, sounds like he's just like translating it a little bit. You'll see what the Rambam focuses on is future actions, okay? But there are Rishonim who interpret this Mishnah to mean that the emphasis is on actions you do that are hidden, like in a private room, or there are like, some people learn this about Hashgacha. So the Rambam is going to emphasize that this is about God's knowledge. That's the main thing he adds here. We're talking about God's knowledge is absolute. Okay, second clause, Rishus Nesuna, control is granted to man. So here the Rambam says, he says, and afterwards, Rabbi Akiva said, do not think that since God, exalted as he, knows all the actions, that this necessitates compulsion, okay, Yischayv ha'hechreach, and that man is compelled to do any of his actions. This is not so. Rather, kol adam bechiri b'ma'asav, every person is free in his actions. This is what is meant by the statement, freedom is granted, meaning to say, every person's free will is given to him, as we explained in the 8th chapter of Shemona Prakim. Okay, so this is, again, is him addressing the classical paradox or contradiction that God knows everything, but that doesn't take away man's free will. Okay, and he refers us to the 8th chapter of Shemona Prakim, which is probably the one that would take the longest to go into. And those who've been in Sunday shiur, I hate summarizing things without reading like the actual text of the Rishon, but I have to do that because last time we tried doing this, it took us like 2 hours to go through the 8th chapter. But I'm going to make a plug for what is the best edition of Shemona Prakim in case you want it. This is the Feldman, Rabbi Yaakov Feldman translation and commentary. It uses the Kafich translation in Hebrew. It has a competent English translation and footnotes, which if you're ever going to learn Shemona Prakim, then learn this. I mean, I'm using my translation, but that's what I recommend. So here is a summary of the entire 8th chapter of Shemona Prakim, okay? And this is where we're going to try not to get bogged down. You can ask questions, but I'm going to reserve the right to put them on the back burner. Okay. Step 1, the Rambam says it is impossible, and this is my summary, not the Rambam's words, it is impossible to be born with virtues or vices, okay, or you can say perfections or imperfections. You can only be born with predispositions, which mean that you can have a predisposition that makes it easier or harder for you to acquire perfections and imperfections. So let's say, for example, you have two, I don't know if it works this way, you have two athletic parents, right? And you are born and you have certain athletic advantages to be able to like be a good basketball player. But if you don't actually train and practice, then you're not going to just become a basketball player, and you're not born a basketball player. It'll just be easier for you to develop that quality. And similarly, if you're born without this disposition, you can acquire it, but it'll be more difficult. Okay, so no one is born with perfections or imperfections. You're born with predispositions, which just make it easier or more difficult to acquire perfections. And when we say perfections, we mean in skills, in techniques, in midos, in mind, okay, the whole gamut. All right. Point number 2, man has free will. Okay, which Rebbe's definition of free will. I have to give a preface here. I think a lot of us are in the same boat that like we've heard a lot of shiurim from Rebbe about these topics and about free will. And it's at the point where I have no idea which versions of the presentation I heard from Rebbe and which ones like came about from my own like learning. So like, this is one of the few things. Free will, according to Rebbe, defined it as man is the cause of his own actions, which I think is a very, very good definition for our uses. Okay, man has free will. And the Rambam goes through 3 problems if you were to say that man did not have free will. Okay, the main reason he says man has free will is he says it's clear from the Torah and from rationality, and he calls it like a muskal rishon, something that's just like innate, that of course we have free will. We can't not live as though we had free will. So it's built in, but he makes 3 arguments. Number 1, if man does not have free will, then the mitzvos would be given in vain. Right? If you had to put on tefillin and you were not choosing to do so, then what's the point of God saying put on tefillin? Or if you couldn't help but speak lashon hara, then what's the point in God saying don't speak lashon hara? 2, all education, labor, precautions, and all forms of preparation would be in vain. So let's say like you have to like if you're a farmer, you have to like plant the crops and like make sure that you take care of them properly. And if you don't, then you're not going to get a good crop. But if it's all predetermined, then like, what are you even striving to do, right? Like it's all set, and he gives many examples where the Torah itself says this. For example, you build a ma'akeh around your fence around your roof, lest someone fall and be injured. Or the Kohen has to warn people who are cowardly to not go to war, because then that might cause a lapse in morale, So the Torah and reason both acknowledge that there is such a thing as preparation. And if everything is just preset, then there's no concept of preparation, no concept in training, no concept of like doing any work to produce something. Okay, so all of this is presupposing free will. And number three, there's a problem with God's justice and injustice, that if God were to command you, if you have a robot, right, and it's programmed to do X, and you say do Y, oh, this is falling apart already. If the robot can't control its actions, and you tell it to do something, and then you beat it up for not being able to like do what it wasn't programmed to do, then that's like, that reflects badly on you, right? So if God were commanding, we're controlling our mitzvahs and averos, and then punishing us or rewarding us, that's just unjust. Okay, so these are the three main problems with saying that there's no free will. Okay, but the main problem is it goes against like rationality. Okay, we good? Okay, taking steps through the swamp. Yeah, okay, not getting bogged down. Okay, then he quotes the sage's statement, "Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz miyirah shamayim." Everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven, which on the surface would seem to say that we only have control over one very small thing, and God controls everything else. Okay, but the Rambam then goes on and explains that that's not to be taken at face value. Really, what it means is we have control over any decision that can result in mitzvos or averos, which is really like all actions, pretty much. Any action that we do can result in mitzvos or averos, and God gives us free reign over those actions. Okay, the only thing that he does not control, the only thing that we don't control is things that are entirely within nature. And he gives a couple of interesting examples, like how tall or short you are. Can't control that. Okay, or I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe eating certain foods or not eating certain foods at a certain age, whatever. But and he says you can't control the weather. Okay, but these are examples of natural phenomena. Those are in God's control, but everything else that human beings do is in our control, and therefore this statement doesn't contradict free will. It supports the notion that everyone has free will. Okay, and I believe the Rambam also talks about this in his letter to Ovadia Hager, if I'm not mistaken, which is a good place to look for elaboration on that. Okay, also if you're looking for the Rambam's shita on bashert, then this is where he brings that up as well. Okay, because he says don't think that like God arranges your spouse for you. Okay. Okay, then he also says, even when we say that everything's in God's hands, we don't mean in real time. So he gives this example. When you throw a stone up in the air and it falls, he says that is God's will from a certain point of view, okay, which is that God created the laws of nature and he programmed, so to speak, the laws of nature into creation. And that is the cause of the rock falling. It's not that God is invisibly puppeteering the rock and going fall, right, at every moment, like some of the Islamic philosophers believe, but rather he set up the world with laws of nature. Okay, then the Rambam, here's another quagmire which we're going to avoid. The Rambam then gives his shita on how all miracles are programmed into the laws of nature, okay, from the time of creation. Okay, that's a whole thing about how miracles work, not even touching that one. And then the last thing is man's bechira, man's free choice. He says, would you agree with the statement that man's standing and sitting are biritzono, are by God's will? So he says it depends on what you mean. If you say that God is controlling man's decision to sit or stand, that's false. Okay, but if you say that God gave man, upright posture and legs with muscles and endowed him with free will to be able to choose to stand or sit at his own discretion. So then, yeah, God is responsible for man's decision to stand or sit, but that's based on the way he designed man. He's not controlling man in every moment. And then he says this, another, for me, weird example. He says, just like God made man with fingers and with a broad chest, so too he made man with free will. Okay, so like, in other words, you have certain things that are part of your physical design. So part of your metaphysical design is you have free will. And just like you only have fingers because God said, let man have fingers, so too you only have free will because God said, let man have free will. Okay, but God's not controlling your exercise of free will. Okay, and that's his full explanation of everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. Okay, I'll pause here for questions in case, yeah. Why is it because, so your question is, if Yirah Shamayim means free will, right? And we're now saying that God is the cause of free will in terms of how he designed man, then what do Chazal mean when they say that everything is in the hands of heaven except fear of heaven? So I think my sense, and I have to go back through with that question in mind, I think he's just stating, he's saying Chazal are talking about they're trying to highlight the fact that man is given control over his choice, but in this third point, he is answering the question that people have when they say, can't man only do something if it's in accordance with God's will? In other words, like there's this concept like kosher chafetz asa, God does everything in accordance with his will, or can man really act outside of God's dominion? So that's the perspective from which he's answering the question, that it's part of God's dominion that he gave up his dominion for man's free will, so to speak. But then Chazal are talking about like the Chazal are pointing out that fact that man has been given the ability to initiate his own causes. I don't know if that was 100% clear. Two different frameworks, yeah. Okay, any other, if we can make it past this, then we made it past the free will questions, but I'll take free will questions, just make sure we're all on the same page. See, if we didn't have free will, then it wouldn't make sense for me to ask you if you had questions, because then either you would know it or you wouldn't know it. The whole thing is absurd. Okay. Yes.
Is there really an equation between free will and the design of the body?
It's a good question. I mean, part of that, so is there really an equation between free will and the design of the body? So the non-answer answer that I'm going to give you is that free will occurs in I'm going to use a technological term to dazzle you and make you obscure the fact that I don't really know what I'm saying. Free will occurs at the interface between man's physicality and non-physicality. Okay, right? So yeah. So the answer is that the design of man's fingers and height and stuff is entirely within the realm of physicality. And we're saying that there is an uncaused source of effects that is in a non-physical part of man, and somehow the two interact. I don't know what the nature of that interaction is. And like Rebbe has said many times, like anyone who asks the question, how, and I know you're not asking this, but how does free will work? You can't ask that question because you can only ask how stuff works if there are causes and effects within the thing. But free will means you're the cause of your own actions, the cause of your own effects. So you can't really ask how it works. So the answer to your question, Donnie, is like I wouldn't say it's exactly the same because we're dealing with a non-physical part of you that is operating through a physical medium. So it's not exactly the same, but it is the same in the sense that God set the natures of all things, and the nature of the human body is to have fingers and a chest, and the nature of the human hybrid creature is to be able to have free will. So it's the same in the sense that it's by design. That's the best I can do.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
Okay. The last point, which is, I think, takes up the most text in the chapter, which we're also not touching, is that there are many psukim which seem to contradict free will. And the Rambam goes and explains all of them and says, see, I answered all the questions. Okay, so you can read that. You could also look at Hilchos Tshuva Perek Vav. Okay. Last part of Perek Ches. Okay, good. All right. Oh, so now the question, which any excited kid asks at a certain point: how do we resolve the contradiction between divine omniscience and human free will? Right? If God knows what we're going to do, then how can we have free will? Okay. Now I believe I also got this from Rebbe. That Rebbe said that you have to split this into two questions. Okay. One is, and this is not the way the Rambam formulates it, but I think it'll be the clearest way to present his answer. One is a question on free will, which is if God knows what we're going to do, then how can we be free? The other question is a question on God's knowledge. If we have free will, then how does God know what we're going to do? Okay, and these are two separate questions. Whenever you find yourself like with that, there's a certain, when you're thinking about this, I don't know what you call it. There's those little rubber snakes with the water in it that you get as a kid, that you try to pick it up, it just slips out of your hand. I feel like sometimes this question can feel like that. Whenever you find yourself confronted with the paradoxality of like free will and omniscience, divide it into these two questions and tackle them in this order, okay? So if God knows what we're going to do, how can we have free will? Okay, now again, as a high school teacher, I've been asked this question many, many times, and especially at Q&A panels, right? And whenever I'm asked the question, the traditional way I respond is I go like this. Okay, so when the shoe was up in the air, for those who can't see, I just threw my shoe in the air. Okay, when the shoe was in the air, did you know that it was going to fall? Yes. Presumably you've had experience with falling things before, right? But does that mean that your knowledge caused it to fall? No, that's the answer. Okay, knowledge doesn't affect causality. Okay, that just because you know something with 100% certainty doesn't mean that your mind caused it. Okay, hold on. Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, now I for a while did not see. For a while. Oh, behind me. Okay, so for a while, I did not see any Rishon explicitly state this in such simple terms, but then over Shabbos, I found the Sforno says what I don't think I'm projecting into the Sforno. So he says like this, in his commentary on this very mishnah, okay, different numbering, there is no excuse for the sinner who may say that he is compelled to sin, since God has foreknowledge of his sin, a foreknowledge which is not subject to any degree of falsehood. For he knows what man will choose in the future, but he is not compelled. In other words, same point as the Rambam, don't think that because God knows what you're going to do means that God is controlling it. Okay, but then he says like this, Sforno says, just as we ourselves know the phenomena of the present without any doubt, and despite this, these phenomena are not compelled, so too the entire future exists before God's knowledge on the level of the present, even though that future has no reality except via his existence. I have no idea what he means by that last part, but he's saying that in the same way that you can know things that are happening right now in the present and your knowledge has no doubt in it, and your knowledge is not compelling it, so too, God, for who's outside of time, everything is as if it were the present for him. You know, there's no past, present, future. And so therefore, God can know it without it being compelled. Okay, that's the closest I can get to the answer. Okay, do you want to ask something from him?
It's true for my knowledge, right?
What?
I mean, that's true for my knowledge. My knowledge doesn't affect God's knowledge. The fact that I know.
Yeah.
How do I know God's knowledge is different? And that it does.
Okay, so the question for those who can't hear is Chaim is saying this works for my knowledge that it doesn't affect causality, but how do I know that God's knowledge doesn't affect causality? Yes, it's Dio. Yeah, sure. No, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's true that like animal observation and say it's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not speak or whatever. But that's just because I didn't create the laws of nature. So my knowledge of it is limited to just sort of witnessing. So
Okay.
Created it on top of
right.
it. So it's not really about just he's not like witnessing it.
Okay, so Chizkiah was saying, you know, the classic distinction between what is the knowledge of the observer and knowledge of the clockmaker or whatever, watchmaker, I don't know, right? That you know that our knowledge is based on observation, and that's where our uncertainty comes from, and that's where any degree of certainty we have comes from. But God designed nature, and so maybe His knowledge works differently. Similar cluster of questions, but yeah, Ari.
Also, it's true that our knowledge is causes the fall.
Yeah.
But nothing else could have happened. There's no other possible outcome.
Right. Yeah.
So then that also, like, it's indirectly means
yeah.
with no choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. So surprise, surprise. This is a deep area. Yeah, the Rambam says is broader than the sea and deeper than the whatever. But thankfully, the Rambam is going to give an answer that will at least put duct tape on your mouths. Okay, which is like this. Okay, God's knowledge. So this is the answer he gives in the Shemona Bracha. God's knowledge is identical with God's essence. Right. So with me, there's me and there's my knowledge and my mind, and then there's the knowledge itself. You know, I'm a being of multiplicity, right? But God is one from every side and every way, no plurality or multiplicity in any way. And we know from many things, we know from the Torah, Lo Ya'ani Adam V'chai, that Moshe asked to see God's essence and to know God's essence, and God said, "Man cannot see me and live," which means you cannot have knowledge of God's incorporeal being without while you are a physical being, okay, because our mind is limited. And so the equation is God's essence is unknowable, God's essence and his mind are identical, and therefore just as you can't know God's essence, you can't know his mind, okay? And that is the Rambam's answer, which he gives again here and in Hilchos Teshuvah 5.5, which is we can't know how God's mind works, okay? And in fact, spoiler alert for Sefer Eov, he says the entire point of Sefer Eov is really to go through that very idea, is to make you realize, as Yeshayahu Hanavi says, Ki lo machshavosai machshavosechem v'lo derechechem derechai ne'umar Hashem, that your thoughts, Hashem speaking, your thoughts are not my thoughts and your ways are not my ways, and that all of the mistakes that we make about in this area about God's knowledge and about reward and punishment and free will, all of them stem from a hidden assumption we have that God's knowledge is somehow like our knowledge. And the goal is to realize that the term knowledge is equivocal when it comes to God. Yeah.
So doesn't that kind of, in a sense, shake up the first answer?
What it does is it ropes it off with police caution tape and says, do not tread here, you know? But it yeah, I mean, so you're asking a good question, which is what does this do? Like the initial question kind of presumed that the knowledge is the same, and now we're making that distinction. So then doesn't this reflect back on the first question also? So yeah, probably does. Okay, but you have to go into what knowledge is, and then you get into trouble if you're the Rabag because you say that God's knowledge is kind of the same nature, and then the Rambam frowns at you, and then you lose your chelik olam haba. So it's a whole complex area. I will mention one more thing also, which I also believe I heard from Rebbe's shiur on free will, but I don't remember at this point. Is he said, why does the question feel so powerful? Okay, because there are people who like who hear this, and some people like I personally am content with this answer, which might mean I'm missing something. Some people though really don't like these answers, and some people like give the squinty eye, like really like Rambam's trying to pull a fast one. I think the Ravid says, why did Rambam even bring this up if he's not going to answer? So I think Rebbe gave a psychological explanation for the strength of the question, which is. Surprise, surprise, a lot of the way we relate to God is patterned after our childhood psyche, right? And the way we related to our parents, right? So when you were, let's use an example. Let's say you had a sibling, okay, and you were an older sibling, right? So if you're a little kid, okay, and you want to hit your sibling, you can't do it if mommy or daddy is watching, right? So you wait until mommy and daddy looks away, and then you hit them, right? Okay. So when you're a kid, parental knowledge actually restricts your action, okay? Because you can't do stuff if you know that your parents are watching. So what I recall Rebbe saying is that way of relating to parental knowledge then extends to the way we relate to divine knowledge. And we feel that if God knows what we're going to do, then somehow we don't have free will, So you're just transposing this childhood psychological relationship to this to your parent onto God, and that's where the strength of the question comes from. But in terms of the logic of the question, again, logically speaking, your questions aside, it's very simple. 2 simple steps. Knowledge doesn't affect causality, and God's knowledge is different than our knowledge. Yeah.
So from a purely hopefully logical perspective,
Yeah.
you can say that the first sentence says that knowledge, how we know it is, so it doesn't affect causality.
Yeah.
When we say that knowledge, how we know it is something like God's knowledge. So how can
That was
answer,
right.
It doesn't seem to,
Yeah, that was what you asked before, right? Yeah.
So
Okay, good.
It doesn't seem like simply logically it
Yeah.
works. It's like, okay,
So,
I'll accept it.
I'm going to make you an offer that you can refuse, but that is that I've made to other people before. So I'm a fan of Mortimer Adler and the great books, and so they outlined 102 ideas that all Western civilization revolves around. And I don't know who the they is, by the way. And they wrote one book where a 2-volume book where the goal was to go through every single thinker on every single question you can ask about free will. Okay, it's a 2-volume book, and I have the volume that deals with that question. If you ever want to borrow it, go ahead. And I have not read it. Okay, but like they tried to systematically go through every single question you can possibly ask on free will with all thinkers and all shitos. So have at it. Yeah.
The second answer is fine with that.
Okay, good.
But there's just the fact that.
And truth is, if you are not okay with the second answer, then chances are, then you have some severe mistake about God, whereas the first answer, okay, fine. Yeah. The main takeaway from this for our purposes, is God's knowledge is different from our knowledge and doesn't affect causality. So as long as you're good with that, then we're good. Yeah.
Okay. So it's also the following question I asked before, but it's a little bit based on the premise, just to be clear on the premise. Humans, the only ones that are named to have free will, and animals don't.
Yeah. Humans are the only creatures with free will. Angels. Okay. Well, okay. There's a. there's. Yeah.
So then it's not. So we at least accept.
Sorry, I have to say the anecdote. So I'm going to interrupt you. I have to say the anecdote. So animals don't have free will. In my first year in yeshiva, then Rabbi Schwartz, I don't know if he's on here. Rabbi Schwartz gave a shiur on chelek and said that angels don't have free will. And this was back when we were recording stuff with the tapes, and then after the shiur, Rabbi went to Rebbe and asked him about that. And Rebbe said, of course, angels have free will, but in a different way. And Rabbi stormed in and said, burn the tapes, And so ever since that moment, I realized, the notion of angels and plain shot angels don't have free will, right? That's why they're called malach, is they are only doing, Ibn Ezra on Chavrusa says that they're only doing the malacha of Hashem. So, but this is part of this complicated question. What do we mean by free will? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. So, and I'm supposing that the reason I would say they don't have free will is because they're bound only with laws of nature.
Right.
So I guess my question is still on that we acknowledge that human beings have a nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, somehow we have an ability to, I guess, override it and call that free will.
Whoops, I hit the next part on the slide. Can't take your question. No. Yeah. Yeah. I am going to stop at this point, which is that for our purposes, we're just going to go with the idea that for man to have free will means that we are the cause of our own actions. And therefore, by definition, again, by the definition that we're using, then God is not causing them. And my explanation for how not is God's knowledge doesn't interfere with causality, just like our knowledge doesn't. I think I'm gonna cap it here. I just want to make sure we get through this here in time, but I will take your question if you still have it by the end. Okay. All right. Okay. So third clause of the Mishnah. Okay, we made it through the swamp. Okay. Uvatova olam nidon. The world is judged with goodness. Okay. So this, when I said in the plan of the shiur that there is a cryptic statement in the Rambam, that wasn't the cryptic statement that we made before. That's the simple statement. This next commentary is a little bit cryptic, and this is the one we're going to delve into in the Talmudic sources after we go through the commentary. He says, Rabbi Akiva then said, Hashem's judgment of mankind is with chesed, with kindness, lo b'dikduk hadin haroi lahem, not with the exactitude of judgment which is fitting for them. As God explained in his attributes, saying, erech apayim, slow to anger, v'rav chesed, and abundant in kindness. The sages said, slow to anger for the righteous and for the wicked. And the prophet said of his attributes, Hashem is good to all. Okay, so the Rambam is explaining what does it mean that God judges the world with goodness? It means with chesed, but not with exactitude. And then he gives three proof texts. One is that one of God's attributes, so to speak, is slowness to anger and abundance in chesed. Another proof text is the sage's statement, God is slow to anger for the righteous and for the wicked. And the third is the statement in Tehillim, Hashem is good to all. Okay, that's what we're going to have to take up later on. Okay, but this is what the Rambam is saying, and he is answering our major question, which is what does it mean, just explanation-wise, that the world is judged in goodness? It means not with exactitude. Okay, then the last clause of the Mishnah, which the Rambam spends the most time on, which is great, but like I wish he spent more time on the other parts also, because this doesn't need to be unpacked as much. Everything is in accordance with the multitude of action, but not based on the actions. What does that even mean? So he says like this, and afterwards Rabbi Akiva said that good midos are not acquired based on the great quality of the action, but on the multitude of the quantity of the actions. This is because good midos are only acquired when man repeats good actions many times, and through this, man will attain a disposition for this. Those are the dispositions we were talking about before, where it's easier for you to do these things. Not when a person does one great action out of the good actions, because through that action alone, he will not acquire a disposition. Okay, so if that doesn't make sense, he's going to give a couple examples. For example, if a person gave $1,000 in one shot to a person who was deserving of this, he would not acquire the trait of generosity through this one great action in the same way as a person would acquire it through giving $1 in 1,000 acts of generosity on 1,000 occasions. Because this latter person repeated the action of generosity 1,000 times and therefore acquired a strong disposition. But this former person who did it once, his soul was aroused with a great arousal for a good action, but then that arousal ceased. So in other words, you can muster up the motivation to do a great action, and he's not downplaying that. He's not saying it's worthless, but he's saying don't think that that is going to give you the quality, the midah, the trait of generosity in this case. You know, you can like bite the bullet and be brave and rush into battle one time, but that doesn't make you a brave soldier. What makes you a brave soldier is exercising and practicing, courage on many occasions. Okay, until it becomes part of your soul. And same thing with the bad actions as well. Okay, then he gives another example. Likewise in Torah. Now, the reason why I highlighted this is because I assume that you like me, like I assumed that in this $1,000 example, I thought he was talking about tzedakah. He's not talking about tzedakah here. He's talking about the trait of generosity, irrespective of its role in the mitzvah system. Okay, about midos in general. He's talking about generosity. Now he extends it to Torah. He says, likewise in Torah, the reward of a person who redeemed one captive with $100, I guess the bandits aren't charging much, or gave $100 of tzedakah to one poor person who needed it, is not as great as someone who redeemed 10 captives or fulfilled the needs of 10 poor people, even at $10 each. You should apply this similarly to other cases. And this is the meaning of his statement, according to the multitude of actions, but not according to the action. So he's saying, just like in midos, you don't develop a midah until you do the action that corresponds with it many times. So too in Torah, the reward you get from God is not going to be the same for doing something many times as it's not going to be the same for doing something once as it is for doing something many times. Okay. And one more point here. Oh, and even though the results are the same. In other words, in terms of the tzedakah you accomplished, these two people are accomplishing the same thing, right? In the first case, right? The guy who, they're both giving away $1,000 of their money, but don't think that that translates into developing the trait of generosity. Okay, now, one more piece of background info, because remember, the Rambam is assuming we've learned all of Shmona Prakim. In the second parak of Shmona Prakim, he talks about what we mean by perfections and imperfections, and he says like this, but the ma'alos is the term that Catholic translates from the Rambam. The ma'alos, the virtues or excellences, are of two types: character perfections and intellectual perfections. And corresponding to them are two categories of vices and imperfections. He gives examples. The intellectual virtues belong to the rational faculty and include wisdom, knowing the remote and immediate causes of things after first recognizing the existence of the one thing one is investigating; intelligence, which includes the theoretical intellect that we have by nature, i.e. innate concepts, as well as the acquired intellect, though this is not the place to discuss that. Okay, clarity and excellence in comprehension, i.e. the ability to grasp everything instantaneously or in very little time. And the imperfections in these categories are the opposites of these things. So let's just play it through with an example. Let's say clarity. Clarity is a trait, okay? So students know that I encourage you to review shiur because you're not going to get stuff out of shiur unless you review it. So let's say one day you're like, I'm going to make a change in my life. I'm going to review today's shiur, and you review it and you get 100% clear, okay? Small round of applause, okay, that's a start, but don't think that that's going to make you into a clear thinker. What's going to make you into a clear thinker? If you do it every day, right? You have to review shiur every day, and you have to review shiur constantly and practice clarity again and again and again in order for that quality to adhere in you. Okay, so I'm dwelling on this because this is true for intellectual traits as well as ethical ones. Okay, then he goes to ethical ones, but the perfections of character are found only in the emotions and psyche, which are served by the senses. There are many perfections in this capacity, including temperance, generosity, righteousness, patience, humility, magnanimity, courage, and sensitivity, and others. And the imperfections of this capacity consist in a deficiency or an excess of these. Classic Aristotelian definition there. Okay, so let's just play this through. I don't think we need examples of how forming good habits occurs through doing stuff many times. But let's think of actually, no, we'll use a good habit, but in a negative scenario. Yosef HaTzadik, right, was confronted with the wife of Potiphar. Okay, and he exercised restraint, temperance, whatever you want to call it, kedusha, whatever you want to label it, and he had to muster up a lot of decision-making, willpower, and knowledge, and all this stuff, and he broke away from her, right, and didn't give in. That definitely affected him, but what really gets you this trait is doing it many, many, many times on many things. That could have been a fluke. Maybe he mustered up the right amount that time and then not afterwards. So all of these qualities, whether intellectual or moral, need repetition in order to stick. Okay, that's the Rambam's point of lefi rov ha'maaseh, according to the multitude of actions, of lo al pi ha'maaseh, but not according to the big action. Okay. So are we ready now to go through the Mishnah and see in our questions which questions the Rambam answered? Yes.
So are we not judged on civil action alone?
Okay, good question. I'm going to partially answer that now, and then the answer will fully emerge at the end of this year. We are every action. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up now. Every action does matter, and you are judged on every action. Clearest pasuk that comes to my limited B'kius Tanakh mind is the end of Koheles. So the sum of the matter, when you consider everything, is fear God and keep his mitzvos, because this is the end of every man. And okay, I don't even remember this. Anyone know the last pasuk of Koheles? I'll read it on my phone. Koheles. I just think Koheles is going to be. I mean, there's many psukim that say this, but Koheles says at the very end, boom, boom, ki es kol maaseh elkim yavi b'mishpat. Al kol ne'alam im tov im ra. Because every action that you do, God will bring to justice, whether hidden, for every hidden thing, whether good or bad. So in other words, every single action that you do is judged by God, even if it's a one-time action, and you do get rewarded for the good things and you get punished for the bad things. And also every action you do affects your midos, for good or for bad. It's just that the way to cultivate these things is going to only be through a multitude. Okay. Good. Okay, let's go through our list of questions on the Mishnah and see which ones the Rambam answers. Okay, so here's our Mishnah again. Everything is seen by God, but control is granted to man, and the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the multitude of action, but not based on the action. Question 1, what is this doing in Pirkei Avos? Avos is supposed to be about ethics, but this is metaphysics. So the answer, this is not going to be fully fleshed out till the end, but is the Rambam making this about ethics? Yeah, he is, right? His main point sounds like the first couple clauses were to set the stage and establish the premises necessary, but the main punchline, according to the Rambam, is that the way to to get good midos is through repeated action. Okay. Again, we're going to come back to this, okay, because this is about God's judgment. Okay. 2, if everything is foreseen, how can man have free will? The Rambam does answer that by saying God's knowledge is different from ours, and you can't know God's knowledge because you can't know his essence. Question 3, what is meant by judged in this context? Is it death? Is it Rosh Hashanah, or always? Not so much. Okay. The Rambam does not explicitly address when we're talking about. Okay. He quotes psukim that apply across the board, like Tov Hashem lakol v'rakamav kol ma'asav, Yugim u'midos harachmim, erech apayim b'rav chesed, which seem to apply at all times, but he doesn't state with definitiveness when are we talking about in terms of judgment. So we're going to set that question aside. 4, what is meant by the world is judged with goodness as opposed to what? So he answers this: the world is judged with chesed, not with exactitude. Now we have to unpack that, which is what we're going to do in the next step, but he does address it. 5, which types of ma'aseh is he referring to? He's referring to non-mitzvah actions and mitzvah actions, right? Midos, intellectual and ethical, and then also mitzvahs and averos. 6, what does lefi rov ha'ma'aseh mean? And 7, what does it mean not in accordance with the actions? That's the simplest idea, which is that you acquire qualities through repetition, not through one big action. Okay, so the question that he did not answer is what is, or that we didn't get an answer from, is what is meant by judged in this context, okay? But to that question, we will add 2 more from the Rambam himself, now that we've seen his commentary. One question is, according to the Rambam, if Hashem judges the world with chesed, okay, i.e. not precisely based on people's actions, how is that in line with justice? And this is a classic question, right, of how you can reconcile midas hadin and midas harachamim, right? Like if it's not based on strict justice, does that mean that God is not fully just, right? How do we reconcile that? And again, I'm not saying that the Rambam is aiming to answer that question, but I do think we can answer it. And then to me, there's still a question, which is not really on the Rambam, it's really in light of the Rambam. What do each of the clauses in the Mishnah have to do with each other? What is the unified ethical teaching that emerges from this? So I said that it sounded like 2 clauses were just establishing premises. I would like to see if there is one main idea that emerges from the entire Mishnah according to the Rambam. Okay, and you could shoot down that question if you want, but that's what I'm looking for in this Mishnah. Okay, all right, yes.
Is that specifically because you want the entire thing to be about like ethics and others?
Yeah. Also, I like looking for the unity in the clauses of Mishnah. I can't say this with definitiveness, but I think there is, I feel like I've encountered a machlokus in how some Foreseen interpret Pirkei Avos, that when you have multiple clauses, how related do they have to be? Like, can you say that there's like 4 different ideas in there or whatever, but my assumption is to look for unity. In the Mishnah and Avos. Yeah. Okay. We good? Any questions? Okay, so now we're on step number 5, which is delving into the Talmudic sources of the most cryptic portion of the Rambam's commentary. So this is the portion we're looking at. I'll read it again. Rabbi Akiva said, Hashem's judgment of mankind is with kindness, not with the exactitude of judgment, which is fitting for them, as he explained in his attributes by saying, Erech apayim, slow to anger, and Rav Chesed, abundant in kindness. The sages said slow to anger for the righteous and for the wicked, and the prophet said of his attributes, Hashem is good to all. Now, Kafech identified 3 sources in the Gemara. I don't know if these are the only 3 sources where the Rambam, where the Rambam got the notion from that God is slow to anger for tzaddikim and rashaim. Eruvin, Bava Kama, and Sanhedrin. Okay, Bava Kama and Sanhedrin are the same, and Eruvin is slightly different. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Gemaras inside with Rashi, okay, understand them, and then Tosfos points out a contradiction between the 2 Gemaras, and then Tosfos resolves that contradiction. Okay, and then that's how we're going to unlock the Rambam. Okay, and I'm not assuming that Rambam and Tosfos and Rashi all have the same ideas. I just use Rashi and Tosfos to like understand the Rambam. Okay, Eruvin says like this: Rabbi Chaga and some say Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said, "What is the meaning of that which is written Erech apayim?" Okay, now this is a little bit difficult in Hebrew. Okay, so apayim is plural. Okay, the word af, plain pshat, literally means. Well, that's figurative, right? That's figurative. We use it as anger. Face or nose. Okay, right? Like nostril or face, right? So this Gemara is taking it as face, right? So it says, why is it written that God is Erech apayim, plural? It should have written Erech af, okay? That's the question, okay, fine. Rather, it means that God is Erech apayim for the righteous and Erech apayim for the wicked. Okay, so he has 2 faces, so to speak. Obviously, God doesn't have any faces, but in the mashal, God has 2 faces. So Rashi explains, apayim implies panim, faces. Whether panim sochalos or panim ben zumos, whether happy faces or angry faces, okay? God's happy face, he extends for tzaddikim for olam haba, but his angry face, he extends to rashaim and delays their punishment for olam haba. Okay, so that's Rashi's explanation. God shows a happy face to tzaddikim of extending for tzaddikim, like prolonging for tzaddikim, and then his angry face he extends to the Rishayim and delays their punishment for Olam Haba. Now, what vibe do you get about delaying the punishment of Rishayim for Olam Haba? Oh, actually, I'm not going to ask the vibe. I'll let Tosfos ask the vibe. Okay, just note this. Okay. Next Gemara, Sanhedrin. Okay. Moshe, so the pasuk says, "Vayimahir Moshe vayikod artzav v'yishtachu." So the pasuk is after the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe is davening to save Klal Yisrael and doing the Yugam Umidos. So Moshe hastened and bowed down on the earth and prostrated himself. So the Gemara says, "Ma ra'a Moshe." What did Moshe see? Okay, which means which of the Yugam Umidos did Moshe see that caused him to bow? Okay. I mean, I would have said all of them, but the Gemara says which one. Okay. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamla Amar. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamla says, "Erech Apayim ra'a." Okay, it's machlokas. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamla says he saw slowness to anger. Rabbanan Amri emes ra'a. Okay, so Rabbi Chanina says he saw erech apayim. Rabbanan said emes. We're not going to go into the emes thing. Okay, so Tanya Kamanda Amar erech apayim ra'a. So Brisa was taught in accordance with the one who said that he saw slowness to anger. Tanya was taught in a Brisa. Kish'ala Moshe lamarom, when Moshe went up on high, and this is talking about when Moshe went up to receive the Torah. Okay, not when he went up for the Egel. When he went up to receive the Torah. He saw God sitting and writing slow to anger. Okay, obviously God doesn't sit or write. Okay, I gotta say, don't get a bad din on Rosh Hashanah. But he saw God writing this. Okay, Amar Lefanav, and Moshe said to God, Ribono shel olam, erech apayim letzadikim. Okay, Master of the Universe, does this mean slowness to anger for tzaddikim? Amar lo, God said to him, Af l'Rishayim, even for the wicked. Okay. Amar lo, Moshe said, Rishayim yovedu, the Rishayim should be destroyed. Amar lo, God said to him, Hashda chazis my debayalach. You wait and see what you're asking for. Okay. Fast forward. Chet HaEgel. Okay. Kishachatu Yisrael Amar lo, when the Jews sinned, then Hashem said to Moshe, Lo kach amartali erech apayim l'tzadikim. Did you, Moshe, want me to only be slow to anger for the tzaddikim? Amar lefanav, and Moshe Rabbeinu said back to God, Ribono shel olam, v'lo kach amarta li af l'Rishayim. Didn't you also say that? Didn't you tell me that God that you're going to be slow to anger even for the Rishayim? So in other words, Moshe was glad that God is slow to anger for the Rishayim, because if it weren't for that, then Klal Yisrael would have gotten destroyed. So God was right. Surprise, surprise. Okay, okay. So and then this is the meaning of the statement. I don't know how this connects, but and now please let the power of my Lord increase as you have spoken to me, saying. Okay, so the upshot is that slowness to anger for the Rishayim ended up being a good thing. And this is what bothers Tosfos. Okay, first Rashi. Rashi gives shot here. He says, God said to him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, didn't you tell me slow to anger should only be for the tzaddikim and not for the Rishayim? And then Moshe said back to God, now it makes sense according to the one who said that Moshe saw slow to anger. For once he saw that this attribute in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he is slow to anger even for the Rishayim, he rejoiced. So Moshe is very happy that God is slow to anger for the Rishayim. Again, attribute is in quotations because God has no attributes. Okay, just be clear, that's referring to God's actions. Okay, so now Tosfos raises a question. Okay, he says, and this is Tosfos in Bava Kama, which is the same text as Sanhedrin. Erech apayim for tzaddikim and for Rishayim. Tosfos says there's a contradiction. In Erevin 22a, which we just read, it implies that slow to anger for the Rishayim is to destroy them from Olam Haba, which is how Tosfos learns it. He learns that basically God will give the reward to the Rishayim for the minimal mitzvahs that they did in this world, so that he can just totally destroy them in Olam Haba. Okay, which sounds like it's bad for the Rishayim that they get it delayed. But in Sanhedrin 111a, it implies that slow to anger for the Rishayim is good, which is why Moshe rejoiced. Okay, so which is it? Is this a good midah or a bad midah from the standpoint of the Rishayim? So the answer is when the Rishayim are not ultimately going to do teshuvah, then slow to anger is bad for them. But when they will ultimately do teshuvah, then it is good. Okay, so depends on, so if you do a chet, okay, you are granted slow to anger. If you, let's say, live out the rest of your life in taking advantage of that slowness to anger by taking advantage of it by not doing teshuvah, so then you get slammed in Olam Haba, right? And it turns out that like hypothetically, like a goat wandering to its death off of a sheer cliff, you went along thinking everything was fine, and then boom, right? You got the consequence, okay? And so it ended up being bad for you because you were allowed to just do whatever you wanted, okay? But if you use that time for tshuva, so then it ends up being that was a really, really good thing that God did for you, because without that time, then if God just punished you instantly, then you wouldn't have changed, and then you would have gotten punished even more. But now you've done tshuva and you get forgiven, okay? So answers depends on how you use it. Okay. And for the tzaddikim, it's going to be good because they're going to use it for tshuva no matter what. Okay. Okay. Hold on. Oh, and then Tosfos in Erevin says similarly. Okay, he says, he raises the same question, or he implicitly raises the same question. Erech Paim for tzaddikim and for Rishayim. He shows a happy face to the tzaddikim. Oh, this is the face one, right? What does it mean he shows a happy face? He shows a happy face to the tzaddikim for the future, for Olam Haba, and an angry face to the Rishayim by delaying their punishment for Olam Haba. And this is also good for the good in that they have an opportunity to do teshuvah, as is implied in Perek Chelek, that it is also for the good. So in other words, even though the Gemara in Erevin says that God only shows an angry face to the Rishayim, Tosfos is unifying all the Gemaras and saying, no, it's good for them if they choose to do tshuva, but it's bad if they continue to be Rishayim. Okay. So now, okay, any questions on those Gemaras? Because if not, then we're ready for the main idea. Okay, so main idea. Okay, and our outstanding questions here on the Rambam are, what is meant by judged in this context, God judging us? According to the Rambam, if God judges the world with chesed, how is that in line with the justice, right? If it's not based, if it's not based on their exact actions, and can we unify the Mishnah? Okay, so here's a one-sentence summary of the main idea. Okay, and this is what I mean when I say that this strays a little bit into metaphysics, but I'm trying to learn this ethically. Okay, so I'm going to state it in metaphysical terms because that's how the Mishnah is using it. Okay, here's the one-sentence summary. Hashem does not judge our actions in a vacuum. Rather, he judges them in the context of our developmental trajectory over the course of our lives. I'll say that again. Hashem does not judge our actions in a vacuum. Rather, he judges them in the context of our developmental trajectory over the course of our lives. Now let's play this through the Mishnah. Okay. Hakol safui, everything is seen, which means that God knows all the facts. Okay, he knows past, present, future. How does he know? We can't know. Okay, but he knows past, present, future, so he knows what's going to develop. Okay, and by the way, you wouldn't need that kind of knowledge. You wouldn't need to talk about that kind of knowledge if you're talking about a being without free will, right? Because in the clockmaker analogy, right, if you wind up the clock, you know what it's going to do from the time that it's wound up, right? But so knowledge of a knowledge outside of time is really only relevant to a being that is the cause of its own actions that can take free will. Okay, we wouldn't need to talk about God's knowledge if human beings were robots that were programmed. Okay, Rishus Nesuna, permission or control is granted. Humans, unlike all other creatures, have a self-determined developmental trajectory. Okay, you cause your own actions, you can develop in whatever direction you want. And I'm going to bolster this with Rambams, okay? And I'm going to make a plug for why you should learn the Aristotelian portions of the Rambam, even though Aristotle is outdated, okay? So little detour, but for a good purpose, okay? So in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Hey, first halacha, then the Rambam says, Rishus kol adam nesuna lo. Free choice is given to every person. Im ratza lahatos atmo l'derech tova v'lios tzadik harshus biado. If he wants to incline himself to the derech tova, to the good path, and to be a tzaddik, harshus biado, then he has the choice to do so. Im ratza lahatos atmo l'derech ra v'lios rasha harshus biado. And if he wants to incline himself to the bad path and to be a rasha, then choice is his. Okay, so it sounds like on the surface, Rambam is just saying you can choose whatever you want. Okay, but keep in mind these yellow highlighted words, derech tova and derech ra. Okay, this is what is written in the Torah. Behold, man has become unique. Okay, this is the Rambam's translation of it. Hein ha'adam haya ke'achad mimenu ladas tov v'ra. Behold, man has become unique. From him is the ability to know good and evil. Kolomar, meaning to say, Hein min zeh shel adam haya echad ba'olam. Behold, this species of man is unique in the world. Ve'ein lo min sheni dome lo b'zeh ha'inyan. And there's no second species similar to him in this regard. Shehehu me'atzmo b'da'ato uv'machshavto yodea tov v'ra. That he, from himself, with his mind and his thoughts, knows the good and the bad, the oseh kol mashu chafetz, and does whatever he wants. And there's no one who can prevent him from doing the good or the bad. And since that's the case, then God kicked man out of Gan Eden unless he stretched forth his hand and take from the tree of life and live forever. Okay, now hold on just 1 second. Okay. All right. I have to plug something in that I just thought of. I'll do it later. And then later on, he says, "Kol adam roy lios tzadik k'moshe Rabbeinu o rasha ki Yeravam." each and every person is fit to become a tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu or a rasha like Yeravam. Now, that does not mean that you can reach Moshe's level, but you can be a tzaddik just like Moshe was a tzaddik. In other words, we each have our own potential and capacities. Yours are not going to be equal to Moshe's. Sorry to disappoint, but you can be a tzaddik in accordance with your potentialities, just like Moshe reached his, and same thing with the rasha. And same thing with all the other character traits: wise and foolish, merciful, cruel, stingy, spendthrift, and for all the other character traits. Okay, now, and he says, and there's nothing that compels him or is decreed upon him, and nothing that draws him inexorably to either of two paths. Again, there's that word again, drachim. Rather, he with himself and his mind, inclines himself to whichever path he chooses. Okay, now why am I emphasizing path? Because if you look at the part of the Rambam that people don't look at typically, which is the first, which is in Perek Sheni, Shlishi, and Revi'i of Hilchos Yesodei Torah, the Aristotelian parts, when you look at the way that the Rambam describes the world, the world of inanimate beings, he says like this: Arba'a gufos ha'elu. These four, he's talking about the elements here. Okay, these four elemental bodies, einon bali nefesh, they do not possess souls. Einon yodin v'lo makirin, they do not have knowledge or discernment. Ela kagufi mesim, they're like inanimate bodies, dead bodies. Each one of them has a pattern of behavior which it does not know, does not apprehend, and cannot change. Okay. So, you know what? I'm quoting the wrong Rambam. This is also a good one, but there's another one where he uses more explicit language, but I'm not going to find it right now. So what's the idea here? The idea is that other things in nature have only one derech and one minhag, and they are not aware of what that derech or minhag is, and they can't change it. Man has whatever derech he wants, good and bad, a derech to be a tzaddik and derech to be a rasha, and can determine his own derech. Okay, and in fact, the part I want to add in, which I just thought of now, Rabbi Saul Zucker gave a shiur, and I don't remember which shiur it was, where he raised a question, and tell me if you remember this. He raised a question of, the Rambam quotes a pasuk in the Torah to prove that man has free will. Okay. And he quotes it from after the Chet of Adam HaRishon, right? That man has become like one of us, or has become unique to do good and bad. What would be the earliest pasuk you could use to prove that man has free will? Okay, yeah, the mitzvah, right? The fact that man got a mitzvah, which is to not eat from the tree. And how does that prove that man has free will? Because the Rambam said before, exactly, that if you don't have free will, then giving mitzvahs is pointless, and it would be unjust to punish man for that. Okay, so again, I don't want to spoil the whole shiur, but Rabbi Zucker gave used that to build an argument that the type of bechira that the Rambam is talking about here is not bechiras maaseh, is not choice in actions. That belongs to man from the very beginning of his creation. That is something that is, some Rishonim, like the Sforno, even learned that that's part of the description of man. Nas Adam Bitzalmenu Kidmusenu. Sforno learns Bitzalmenu refers to the intellect, and Kidmusenu refers to freedom of action. Okay, I don't think the Rambam necessarily learns it that way. But in other words, in the first parak of Breshis, or the second parak, you see that man has free will. So why is the Rambam quote from after the Chet? Because this is referring to a different type of bechira, which is bechiras derech, the choice of the path that you go on, which is to be a tzaddik or a rasha. And that bechira was changed after the Chet, as the Rambam explains in the first 2 chapters of the Mor Nevuchim, Ayin Sham. Yeah. Changed or did it? Depends on how you learn the Rambam Gan Eden. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's for some other time. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to underscore here is man can choose his derech, whereas nothing else in nature can choose its derech. Okay. Nothing else in nature can choose its actions either, arguably. Okay. Except the point about angels that I mentioned. But nothing can choose its derech, but man can choose his derech. And I don't need to support this from outside of Torah, but when I was preparing this year, I thought of this great chapter in Mortimer Adler's 10 Philosophical Mistakes, when he's contrasting human nature with other natures. And he says, in the case of other animal species, the specific nature common to all members of the species is constituted mainly by quite determinate characteristics or attributes. So that's why you'll find, for example, like all lions are basically the same. All rose bushes are basically the same. There's minor variances based on material factors, but they're basically the same. And they're determinate, they're set. In the case of the human species, it is constituted by determinable, not wholly determinate characteristics or attributes. An innate potentiality is precisely that, something determinable, not wholly determinate, and determinable in a wide variety of ways. And if that doesn't make sense, here's the part that should make sense. Man is to a great extent a self-made creature. Given a range of potentialities at birth, he makes himself what he becomes by how he freely chooses to develop those potentialities by the habits he forms. Okay, and that's why this passage came to my mind, because that's the Rambam's message. Okay, so back to our statement of the main idea. Yeah.
The field of the path is like a more broad.
Yeah. Yeah. In other words, okay, another way to say it is, so let me state it. There's another quote from Eric Hoffer, who's the guy who wrote The True Believer. Just 1 second. I'll get the quote. Eric Hoffer, animals. Yeah, he says, animals can learn, but it is not, I'm not going to share. Animals can learn, but it is not by learning that they become dogs, cats, or horses. Only man has to learn what he is supposed to become. Okay, so an animal has one developmental trajectory. Now I can share the screen, hold on. An animal has one developmental trajectory. Again, I think it's easier to think about it in terms of plants, right? Plant will just, has potential to grow in a certain way, and it will grow in that way, and that's it. A rose bush cannot become a lily, right? Or whatever, but man has multiple drachim that he can develop according to, both in terms of tzaddik and rasha, or you could become a chacham, you could become a fool, you could become a spendthrift, you could become a stingy person, and that is saying more than just that you control individual actions. You can set it's not just the means, it's the end, and what type of organism you become, and it's true, you can't become a malach, but there is a huge range of potentialities that you can become through how you exercise your free will, and that does extend broader than the decision to stand up or sit down. Am I answering your question, or am I missing it? Right. And eating a fruit is bechira, but it's not bechiras derech, which is really what the Rambam is talking about here, about becoming a certain type of person. Okay, back to the main idea. Again, my formulation of the main idea: Hashem does not judge our actions in a vacuum. Rather, he judges them in the context of our developmental trajectory over the course of our life. So first clause in the Mishnah, God knows all of the factors and facts. 2, humans, unlike all other creatures, have a self-determined developmental trajectory. 3, uvatov ha'olam nidon, according to the Rambam, is Hashem's judgment considers the fact that we make mistakes and need time to do tshuva. Okay, that's what the Rambam was emphasizing by quoting the Chazals, that the reason why God is slow to anger and doesn't punish immediately is because that's not how human development works. In other words, you need time to be able to investigate your actions and figure out how to plan a change of course, okay? In other words, here's an example, back with a robot, okay? If a machine breaks, there's absolutely no point in relating to it with Erech HaPayim. Why? Because it can't fix itself. And its breaking was was a lack in its programming. So if a machine breaks, you just immediately fix it. There's no point in having Erech HaPayim. But with a human being, because we have to make mistakes and we only change through our knowledge of ourselves and our cultivation of our habits, there needs to be a time span in which a person can change, okay? And God grants us that. And that's why it's not bediktu kama'aseh. God doesn't punish us with the exactitude due to us for the individual actions in a vacuum, right? You speak lashon hara and you get zapped, or you do mitzvah and you get rewarded, because that would be a distorted way to relate to a human creature, right? That would be looking at it as, again, with a machine, you can look at one little function that the machine does and assess that. Is it doing the function or is it not doing the function? But with the human being, it's all part of this network that is developing throughout time. And that's the framework in which God judges us. Yeah. Oh, do you have a question? No, okay. And that's why I believe the Rambam quoted those chazals, because it's saying that for both tzaddikim and rashayim, we call Erech HaPayim midas harachamim. Okay, now I gave a shiur 2 years ago on Erev Yom Kippurim, which I still say is the most important shiur I've given on Torah in this yeshiva. And if you want more out of your slichos, then I want to plug that shiur, okay? And according to that shiur, the Ralbag explained it that it's not Yugam Midos Harachamim, it's Yugam Midos of how God relates to all of existence, okay? Not just human beings, but all of existence, and not just Rachamim, but Din also. And that's kind of the way I view the Yugam Midos, okay? I know we call them Rachamim because that's the way we focus on it, but my point is that the Rambam is not saying that God is like, he's saying that this is the way God judges human beings. In other words, it's not that God could have judged human beings with exactitude, but he chooses to judge them with chesed. Okay, that might be true for all other areas of creation if judgment is even relevant, but for human beings, the only way to judge human beings is by giving them time to develop. How much God gives them might be a matter of chesed or whatever, but I'm saying I'm trying to make this argument that that this is the only way that you can have a creature that takes time to develop through decision making is by giving them a certain amount of time. Yeah, Fizikio?
So you're saying you're basically focusing on instead of kind of high focusing on the most aspects, more like this is the only, I guess, accurate way, which is more.
Yeah, and that's part of what I address in the Yugamo Midos here of Rav Chesed, the MS are mentioned. You know, those are both Midos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You know, okay. Last point is what matters most, and I'm saying I phrased it this way because of what Yeshua said. This is not the only thing that matters, but what matters most is not the big actions, but the habits we cultivate, which form our intellectual and ethical Midos. Okay, like the Rambam said, you can muster up enough generosity to give $1,000 to in one shot. Right? And that's good. And you get rewarded for that. And that does impact your character. But what actually impacts your character to change the type of person you become is exercising generosity on a regular basis, even if it's smaller. And same thing with reviewing shiur, same thing, you know, with your intellectual midos is let's use a bad midah, right? Is that, you know, we all have, there's such a thing as intellectual, okay, laziness, according to Sadigon in Mishlei is the impulsive need to avoid all immediate pain and conflict, okay? Now we can get lazy when it comes to our learning, okay? And the way that expresses itself in our learning is that we are not careful when we learn, we aren't careful to review, we just wanna like take the easiest route possible. So you can give in to laziness one time, okay? And that's not going to wreck you. But if you repeatedly give into it, you will become an intellectually lazy person, you know, and with intellectual is rizus or charitzus, right? Alacrity. That's also what you have to do is you have to monitor what habits am I forming, not what did I do on this one case. I'm going to pat myself on the back or beat myself up for these actions. Okay. And again, individual actions do matter, but what actually shapes you as a person is the habits that you cultivate. Okay. And that's the unified idea here of the Mishnah, which is that and this is why I call this Rabbi Akiva's view of human existence. Okay, we'll get to the Rosh Hashanah in a second, but that the way Rabbi Akiva is framing human existence in this Mishnah is that we are developing creatures, and that's how God relates to us. And therefore, the thing to focus on as a developing creature is what are the small habits you are choosing to do to constitute who you become, not what's the one action you did on Tuesday that you feel really good about or the bad action that you feel really bad about. Okay, and again, you have to think about those things, but think about them through the prism of habits and development, not in a vacuum, because that's not how God thinks of it, so to speak. Okay, any questions on the main idea before we do the last part of this year? Yes, Akiva.
Is God judging, I guess, is it like the decisions you make on the development choices or like the habits you form?
So this is going to be addressed in a non-addressing way in this last part. Okay, so if I don't answer this question in step 7, then ask me again. Okay, yeah. What? Repeat your question.
You mean like are you being judged on the decisions, not your actions, but like the decisions to one side or the other, of your trajectory, or like the end habits?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer it in part here, but I think the answer is going to be fuller later, which is you, unlike God, you have limited knowledge, right? So you can't always tell what the results are going to be, right? You just can make the best decision you can, given your knowledge of yourself and the circumstances, make these plans and follow through with them. But you also have to course correct, you know, at regular intervals to make sure that you didn't make a mistake at the beginning, or that make sure that the plan is playing out the way that you chose. So I would say that in terms of what you should, I don't know how God evaluates things, but what you should focus on is the decisions, but then constantly evaluate those decisions also, as opposed to the results, because you can't. The results are not in your hands either. Yeah. Did you have a question, Dave? Yeah.
Yeah, I just there's like a little bit of tension between the idea of each of these decisions are great decisions. And
Yeah. Yeah.
There's like a habit form.
Right.
Habit, and it seems to imply there's some inertia to the next decision.
Right. So the Rambam has this in my favorite statement of the Rambam in this is, and I quote this all the time, and I always introduce it by saying this is the most underrated Rambam in the entire Hilchos Teshuvah, because people tend to not learn Perek Vav, okay, which is about where he addresses all the questions, the psukim in the Torah that seem to contradict free will. So one of the psukim that he quotes is yeah, you want. That God is good and upright, and therefore he instructs sinners on the path and teaches the humble his way and guides the humble in mishpat. And so the pasuk, if you read it superficially, seems to imply that God is kind of like controlling or manipulating sinners, okay, to do tshuva, okay. So the Rambam explains it, and he says, what does this mean? That how does God guide the sinners? So he says, that God sent them neviim that teach us how to do tshuva. And then furthermore, I have to get the Rambam, and I'm not going to do it on the screen here, unless someone can run and grab the Rambam. But okay, I just want to read the Rambam's exact lesson here. No, I got it. Okay, Hilos tshuva. So this is in Vav He. He says like this. The ode, furthermore, that God gave them the capacity to learn and to understand. This characteristic is in every person. The more a person is drawn after the ways of wisdom and righteousness, he desires them and pursues them. This is what Chazal said. So that one who comes to be purified is assisted, which the Rambam does not learn as a hashgachic intervention, that God like works things out for you. Rather, klomar yimsa atmo nezer al davar. He finds himself assisted in the matter according to that mita that he said, which is that the idea is that the more you cultivate your derech to be one that revolves around chachma and tzedek, the more of a positive momentum you're going to have. And the opposite is also true. And the way you frame the question, Dave, that like it seems to, there's a tension between the choice in an action and the derech. Yeah, and to that extent, I mean, I'm under the impression, and I don't know if this is heretical or not, that Moshe Rabbeinu, in a way, had less bechira than you and I do, because he was so perfected that like he's not, in conflict to the same degree that we are. Like the Ram, I'm saying, and it's not totally heretical. The Ram says he was like a malach almost, and so there is that phenomenon. And so too, Paro, let's say, you can get so mired in the animalistic nature that you have that you lose your bechira. So there is a tension, and like the best thing you could do for the tension is like, is through the individual little habits, like get yourself more on one derech and off the other derech. Okay, last step, Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says, I'll just read it in English. The world is judged in 4 periods. On Pesach for the produce, on Shavuos for the fruit of the tree. On Rosh Hashanah, all the inhabitants of the earth pass before him like sheep. As it is stated, the one who forms their hearts together, who understands all their actions. And 4, on Sukkot, we are judged on the water. And this is the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Dalet. Rambam here famously says, V'hanigla mizeh hamamar mavur. The plain meaning of the statement is clear. Okay, kasher tir, like you'll see. Aval hanister inyano kashem od bli safek. But the hidden meaning is very difficult without a doubt. Okay, meaning to really understand this judgment and how it works requires knowledge of God's hashgacha and God's knowledge and human action. And this is my way of saying that, like, I take everything with a big grain of salt. Okay. Furthermore, and I have not looked into the sugya, and if anyone could recommend a good shiur on this, then I'm really curious about it, because this was really bothering me this year. The 4-way machlokas, I guess, on when the world is judged. So in Talmud Bavli, in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Tes Zayin Amud Beis, you have 4 opinions. It was taught in a brisa, everyone is judged on Rosh Hashanah, but their decree is sealed on Yom Kippurim. That's the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says everyone is judged on Rosh Hashanah, but their decree is sealed on each one in its proper time, meaning on Pesach for the produce, on Shavuos for the fruit of the trees, and on Sukkot for the water. Rabbi Yossi says man is judged every day. Rabbi Nassan says man is judged every moment. Okay, now the reason why I'm bringing this up is to show that even Chazal had huge machlokas, it seems, on how God judges the world. Okay, and I'm not going to take a stance on that. All I want to do is acknowledge the problem and then say, given our Rosh Hashanah that we're about to enter into in T-minus whatever hours, 7 hours, then like, can we use the idea that we just learned to relate to Rosh Hashanah in a productive way and also to set up the year in a productive way? Okay, so surprise, surprise. Okay, this is not me. The Rambam says focus on habits. Okay, and what I was going to do, because I thought I chose not to do this. I was going to make this a combined shiur about go through like habit cultivation techniques. Okay, but I knew I wouldn't have time. So I've mentioned these books before, but the 3 books that I recommend for habit cultivation, the 3 books I recommend the most are Atomic Habits is the number 1, Tiny Habits is number 2, and Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard is 3. And people don't, this is a big machlokas that Rabbi Moskowitz and I had constantly, right? Which is that Rabbi Moskowitz was of the opinion that you should not ever try to force change. You should just go over the ideas and they'll be real to you. And the more you go over them clearly, they'll be real to you and the change will happen on its own. Okay. And I was firmly of the opinion of no, Rabbi Moskowitz, there are things you can do to accelerate change and to lock change in when it's happening. That's why I am a big believer in learning. There are ways to hack changes and to make them stick. And these are the books that I found most valuable, but you don't have to use these books. Just be aware of what habits you are currently practicing and then focus on the individual habits. And the way I would say it, we're gonna skip this for 1 second here. No, okay. All right, well, let me make 2 more steps and then the shiur will be over. So the question is, how do you combine this with Rosh Hashanah? Okay, so I'm trying to work out a shiur on this new approach to understanding an overlooked aspect of tefillah. Okay, and the shiur was inspired by this Ralph Waldo Emerson line. Okay, in his essay Self-Reliance. I don't think that this fully captures Judaism's idea of tefillah, but I think it's a perfect way to look at the tefillahs of Rosh Hashanah. And I'm going to read it in context, but the one line I want is the line in yellow. Okay. In what prayers do men allow themselves? That which they call a holy office is not so much as brave and manly. Prayer looks abroad and asks for some foreign addition to come through some foreign virtue and loses itself in endless mazes of natural and supernatural and mediatorial and miraculous. Prayer that craves a particular commodity, anything less than all good, is vicious. Here's the line. Prayer is the contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. It is the soliloquy of a beholding and jubilant soul. It is the Spirit of God pronouncing his works good. But prayer as a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft. It supposes dualism and not unity in nature and consciousness. As soon as the man is at one with God, he will not beg. He will then see prayer in all action. Okay, so we have to wait to see if we come up with a shiur for this. But prayer is the contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. I think people ask this question about how is Rosh Hashanah the first of the Aseres Ymei Teshuvah? We really don't highlight Teshuvah on it. And if you look at the actual tefillos, we really don't highlight Yom Hadin, right? And that's again in the piyutim and all the stuff that was added to the tefillah. Then Yom Hadin has center stage. But in the psukim, there's no talk of Yom Hadin, and in the actual tefillos, we focus on Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, which really, there's in Zichronos, Ezo L'cherev, Ezo L'ra'av, there's some aspect of din, but the main focus, I would argue, is Rosh Hashanah is the ultimate reality check. All tefillah is a reality check, but Rosh Hashanah is the ultimate reality check where you're contemplating life from the highest point of view through Malchios, through Zichronos, through Shofros. If you need a shiur on that, I still think the best shiur that I've heard personally for that shiur is the one that Rav Pesach gave to the women in 2007 or 2008. Talk to Joey Lifter for his notes on that, or I can send you the recording. But all 3 of those things is really looking at man through the perspective of Hashem as Melech and where man stands in existence, and then Zichronos about what am I, what is really which actions really constitute who I am, and then Shofros of Gilui Shechina. However you learn those things, I think that what the way in which Rosh Hashanah kicks off the Aseres Ymei Teshuvah is you're getting clear your ultimate framework. What am I and where do I stand in existence? And you're starting your teshuvah from there. Okay. And to sum it up, and this is now the last slide of the shiur, but this is the practical takeaway is as follows. There is this feeling when Rosh Hashanah hits and the Aseres Teshuvah hit of panic, I got to make changes, right? Don't react to the Aseres Ymei Teshuvah panic by saying, I'm going to make big changes. Instead, say, I'm going to make small changes in my habits because that's the only way to affect big change. Okay, and focus on the small habits. Better off to make small changes that are sustainable than big changes that are going to fade away after Sukkot or before Sukkot. Okay. Second is utilize the shofar. The Ramam, especially in shofar of whatever I did shofar you want. The Teshuvah 3, 4, whatever. The cry, Aim Sisera, Olam She'eino Shalach, whatever these ideas are. Utilize them to wake yourself up and realize the need for change. Oh my God, what have I been spending the year doing? and then utilize the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah to contemplate the facts of life from the highest point of view and engage in habit cultivation teshuvah from that vantage point, from the perspective of who am I as a creature in the world that exists lifnei Hashem, and what year did I come from and what year am I going into? And that's the type of teshuvah you should do, okay, in my opinion. And the last thing is remember that Hashem does judge the world with chesed and relates to each person not as a human being, but a human becoming. You are on a trajectory of development, and that's how God judges you. Now, of course, there still has to be an emas hadin, a fear and a trembling before God, because you do have limited time and you will be called to judgment. But remember that it is I think there's a knee-jerk, childish, infantile perspective of God is taking a snapshot of who you are right now, and therefore I have to like fake a bunch of good actions and like not think about a bunch of bad actions, and like then I'm gonna get a good judgment. That's obviously you can't fake God out anyway, but you have to realize like no, like this, when you stand before Hashem on Rosh Hashanah, standing before Hashem means saying this is what I am and this is who I am becoming, but the only one who can determine it is me. I'm the only one who determines stuff, and that's a terrifying idea. If that doesn't give you emas hadin, you're not really thinking about the fact that I am totally responsible for everything I become, and God is in His chesed like facilitating, like giving me this entire system and all these mitzvahs to help that, but like it's all on me. But it's developmental, it's over time, and I should use this to set myself up for the best trajectory for the year, not like in the moment, in that one little moment. And so that's that is the takeaway. And again, I'm happy to, I've gained a lot from doing like, habit cultivation workshopping type things. Like someone says like, oh, I need like help with a certain thing. And like, we should work out like how to develop better habits, so like, I love talking about that because it helps me as well. So, or if you want to borrow any of these books, then you can borrow them. So that's the end of, 12 o'clock. Okay, good. That's the end of the shiur. And I'll take questions now. Yeah, Donnie?
How do you reconcile or look in fact the opposite? Every shiur yourself every day, like
Okay. So Donnie's question is how do you reconcile this with the fact that Rambam says you should view yourself every day as though you're inclining towards death, right? That you could die at any time and maybe you'll be caught dead without having done teshuvah. So off the cuff answer is I think that is talking about the reality that you are a developing being, but you don't know that whether you or not you're going to die. You don't know how much time you have, right? So like you should not plan as though you have infinite time, and make sure that you don't waste the day that you do have in terms of what you do. But again, like you don't know, like statistically speaking, you're not going to die tomorrow, right? But this is the only, this is again, I'll say this again, this is my shot in, people say you should live each day as if it's your last, right? And statistically, that's not true. And therefore, if you try to implement that literally, you end up faking yourself out. Like, oh, I could die tomorrow, right? Wink, wink, like that doesn't work. But one thing is clear, this is the last time you will have this exact day, right? We are on Erev Rosh Hashanah in the year 2022 with these people here, having just gone through this idea. You're going to be going to certain meals. You're going to be having certain tefillos. You will never, ever have that day again, right? That's a certainty. Whether you're going to die is not a certainty, but you're never going to have that exact day again. So that perspective of realizing I'm losing this day, that's for sure. And like, I need to make these developmental decisions, taking statistics into account, but realizing that like, I can't waste a day of just like letting it coast or going on autopilot. That's the best I can do for that answer.
It sounds like a little bit.
There is a tension, and the tension is coming from our lack of knowledge of how much time we have. If we knew how much time we had, there would be no tension, because you could plan out how much time you have left and then make a plan that's catered towards that period. It's only from our lack of knowledge. Yeah, Chizkiyahu? Yeah. Yeah.
It says there needs to affect private and meanness and that supposes dualism not being nature.
Yeah.
So to kind of talk about how this sheds light on, I guess we should look at the field of Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
Would that include that idea of focusing on
consciousness.
Yeah. So for those who can't hear, because I was asking about this line here, that prayer as a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft. It presupposes dualism and not unity in nature and consciousness. So the short answer to that, again, I want this to be a whole shiur, but the short answer to that is that's why tefillos in general are formulated by the klal, not about individuals. And even when you ask for your own needs, it's in the perspective of everything. And especially the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah is about, Malchios is about the entire world, right? Zichronos is about all of humanity. Shofars is about all of Klal Yisrael. And the addition to the third bracha in the Kedushas Hashem is about a society built around the recognition of Malchus Hashem and the unity of God. You know, that's the theme of Malchus Hashem is God's oneness, you know, which we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad in the thing. And this is why the Yugam Umidos are also like God, you're focusing on how God relates to everything, not just how God relates to me, particularly. And that's again why, like, you know, is the focus on my individual din really the best thing? No, it's not, because it's forcing you into this like perspective where you're not viewing yourself as a nivra, as a created being that's part of like God's entire system. So really, you should be focusing outward, you know, and to the extent that you focus outward on contemplating facts of life from the highest point of view on Rosh Hashanah, then on the Aseres Ymei Teshuvah that follow, you can work on your individual self. But the tefillos are all about the general group. And you got to remember also, the Rambam says in the end of the Moreh Nevuchim and elsewhere that the purpose of the Yugam Umidos is so that you emulate that, right? It is knowledge of how God operates, but he says the only reason why, he says this in Hilchos Deos Perek Aleph, the only reason why God is described in anthropomorphic, gross, wrong, bad terms is so that you can emulate his midos, the halachta b'drachav. So if you're sitting there on Slichos or Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and you're saying Erech HaPayim, Rav Chesed, and then you're not using that to say, oh, that's talking to me that I should be engaging in Erech HaPayim with people and slowness to anger with people who like need patience and who are developing or doing Chesed. If you're not emulating them, you're not going to get the Rachamim, right? And that's why the Gemara says, and this is also another good Rabbi Zucker shiur on Slichos. How can the Gemara say that bris krus l'yugam umidos shelo einon chozoros rekan, right? Like that there's a bris that was made with the yugam umidos that they never return empty-handed. Meaning, anytime you do the yugam umidos, then it works, right? And he says, what is it, like a magical formula? The answer is no. That since the yugam umidos is going over Yedias Hashem, that knowledge of God that results in you changing your behavior and aligning yourself with God's will about how He designed the world, they have to work. If you change yourself, if you live according to the Yugam Umidos, then you are aligning yourself with God's design, and they will work. It's not like you're throwing it out there and then God's going to respond, you know? So yeah, and again, I just want to say that because we're going to be, this is really from Yom Kippur, we're going to be saying Yugam Umidos a lot in between now and Slichos and in Yom Kippur. And if you're not hearing Rav Chesed and then saying, how can I cultivate midos of Chesed? You're just not going to get the mercy, right? You know, and except maybe by the Erech HaPayim thing of like, oh, he's such a dunce, he hasn't realized it yet. You know, we have to like let him, you know, operate. So yeah. Okay. Any other? Yes, David.
Can you clarify your understanding of the big actions and the small actions? It sounds like you're saying a lot of doing the small actions, but I think that there is also value in the big actions.
Yeah.
Like breaking through certain clarity.
Yeah. So there's a time for, there's not a Koheles possible, but there's a time for big actions and a time for small actions. And like the example I gave with Yosef, like he needed to, at that moment, muster up this whole, you know, whatever he did to like break away from Asia's Potiphar, because the consequences would have been disastrous. And so too, like sometimes in order to be able to engage in the small habit cultivation, you need to break through a certain fence. Like there's a pasuk in Mishnah that says, Derech ha'atzel ki mesuchas chadek, something, which is that the way of the lazy person is as if there's a fence of thorns. And the shot that Rabbi Moskowitz and I came up with one year was, it's like if you're like going through the forest and there's like a thorny thing, sometimes if you just like if you walk slowly, you would get all cut up. But if you like barrel through it, you know, then you get past that. So with laziness, if it's the compulsion to avoid immediate pain to avoid immediate pain and suffering. So sometimes you need to muster up like stuff to break through that initial thing, you know, come to shiur. And then once you're in shiur, you realize you enjoy it, you know, or like establish a chavrusa and like go through that awkward pain of like setting it up and like making the commitment. And then once you do that, then you're able to continue it. So I would say that is the role of the big actions. So just to summarize, the role of big actions is at least two. One is in individual cases where the rewards you would reap for doing the big action are are big, or the consequences of doing the bad action would be disastrous, then you need to do the big action and avoid the small, you need to do the big good action and avoid the big bad action. And then sometimes in order to jumpstart the habit cultivation machine, you need to engage in big actions at the outset in order to be able to get into the habits. There's probably more answers to that, but those are 2 guidelines for now. Okay. Have a ksiva v'chasima tova.
Thank you.
Thanks.